All right, the recording is on. And welcome everyone. This is the Common Ground on the Hill. It is actually the Storytelling to Taking It Further class. And I've had the joy to teach this class a couple of years now. And this particular year was quite special because of the ladies in the class have all, been together before in various classes I've had, but they've also been together themselves. But I'm going to be quiet and let them tell stories. And my complete job is to make sure to introduce Miss Melanie Nilsson. Melanie is also one of the teachers at Common Ground the Hill, not this particular week, so she could step in and do this. And she'll be the MC for us today. And I will let her go forward. I will, as people get ready to talk, put them in the spotlight view so that you'll be able to all see them. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Sheila. And thank you to all of our guests who could be here today, and welcome. I am just going to start with a couple of Zoom storytelling etiquette tips. If everybody can stay on mute while our tellers tell, and then at the end of their story, feel free to show your gratitude in whatever way that you wish. If you clap, clap in your screen. You're also free to unmute yourself and hoot and holler, and then I'll ask you to read in time for the next introduction of a speaker. But what I want to begin with before I introduce our first teller is to tell you how we got to this point today. So 1 year ago, as Sheila mentioned, at Common Ground on the Hill, all of us were taking classes with Sheila. And Sheila was this incredibly inspiring mentor to all of us. And at the end of the summer, we thought we should have a local storytelling group. So 4 complete strangers, the 4 of us, decided we're going to just try to make this work. So we started to gather, having no real plan. And it took us 3 meetings to even come up with a name, but we decided on Tellers. And getting together to workshop our stories, practice, then led to snacks and tea and outings to DC. We also had a big lavish dinner and Sheila was able to come in and join us. And I think that it's really been the power of storytelling that has taken us from 4 complete strangers last summer to 4 really close friends this summer. So I'm really happy to be the MC and get to introduce each one of these people. And the way I'm going to do these introductions is for each storyteller, I'll give you a little information about them. And then I'm also going to tell you one line or one piece of learning I took from a story they told over this past year. And that'll give you some idea of their versatility as storytellers. And also, should you want to speak with them later, you might be able to get them to tell you that story as well. So our theme for today is love in the time of COVID. And our first storyteller is going to be Sarah Tate. Sarah is a Carroll County public school teacher. She teaches 3rd grade. And she's also an artist. She does things in paper craft and has an Etsy shop. Sarah is an amazing person. She's been an incredible presence in this tellers group. She's the person who will sit there rather quietly and then a half an hour later says 5 words and shows you this incredible depth of wisdom. And so she's really taught me over the year the power of listening and the power of being able to take all of that in. The line or the piece of the story from this past year that's really stuck with me is that I learned from one of her stories that the phantom in the opera is sometimes that dark side of yourself that gets in your way of trying to achieve your goals, but you can move past that. So without further ado, I welcome Sarah Tate to tell her story.
Thank you, Melanie. Getting to know someone virtually can happen a lot faster than getting to know someone face to face. I, like most young people, have been on several online dating sites over the past few months. And at the beginning of March, I found Nick's profile. He was very cute. He was tall, had a shaved head and glasses. So I swiped right and we matched. He started messaging me and our conversation was very light. But as sometimes happens with online dating, the conversation petered off. When that happens, you know that it's just time to move on. So I assumed when I didn't get another message, we weren't a match, and that was it. About 2 weeks passed, and out of the blue, Nick messaged me again. How are you doing with everything with COVID? And in that 2 weeks of silence, a lot had changed. COVID had just kind of become a serious thing on the national stage. I'm a third grade teacher, and my school had closed down for 2 weeks, and they had just announced that we were going to be closed for at least another month, that we were going to be teaching virtually. I had packed up my things and my cats and gone to my parents' house to quarantine with them so that I wouldn't be by myself during this time. So things were just very different than they had been the 2 weeks before. When Nick messaged me again, we moved pretty quickly into texting one another. And we had some very different kinds of conversations. Some of our conversations were very light, easy, the kind of things you would talk about on a first date. We talked about our star signs, which of course, when I found out Nick was a Taurus, I had my friend complete our star chart to find out our compatibility. We talked about our love of animals, the TV shows we liked. But we also had some very serious conversations, the kinds of conversations that you don't usually have on those first few dates. We talked about our personal struggles, our past relationships, and our wants and needs. And we very quickly became very close. The other thing that brought us together was the shared experience of living through COVID. Even though we were far apart and hadn't met one another face to face, we were experiencing the same fears. We were seeing the same things happen on the news. So it gave us another thing to connect over. As we grew closer, Nick and I started talking and texting all day, every day. It was easy to do this because we were both at home and had more time than we normally would have. We did this for 2 months. We talked and texted every day for 2 months, and our feelings grew and grew until we decided that we didn't want to wait any longer. Quarantine be damned, we wanted to meet. But in our meeting, we did want to be safe. So we decided to have a socially distant first date. This was different than any kind of date I've had before. We couldn't go out for drinks or for dinner or to the movies. We decided that Nick would come to my apartment, that I would clean, so it was very sanitized and safe, that we would socially distance, that we would wear masks when we weren't eating, and that would be the way that we could see one another safely. In preparing for this date, things are a little different than preparing for any other date. Of course, when you have someone over for the first time, you want to impress them, you want your place to be nice and neat, but this was beyond anything I've done before. I sanitized everything. When I made dinner that night, I cleaned the kitchen and sanitized after every step in preparing my shepherd's pie. The day of the date came. I heard a knock on the door, and I opened it, and there was Nick in his mask. My instinct was to step forward and hug him, but I knew I couldn't do that, so I backed up into the hall so that there would be 6 feet of distance for him to be able to come in. Fortunately, we very quickly discovered that we were as comfortable and happy with one another in real life as we had been virtually. Our relationship translated very nicely. So we sat on the couch on opposite ends, and we talked through our masks. It was tricky because we couldn't see one another's smiles. We couldn't hold hands. We couldn't be close. But after that first date, socially distanced or not, we decided that we wanted to see one another again. and that this time we wanted to actually be able to interact, not socially distance. So I decided that I was going to leave my parents' house, where I had been living with my parents, and my mom's a nurse, and was working through COVID. So I decided I was going to leave my parents' house and self-quarantine in my apartment for 2 weeks so that we could safely have an actual date. Those 2 weeks were a little tough, being by myself, but they passed. And the Friday night after those 2 weeks were over, I heard another knock on the door. I opened it, and there was Nick, this time with no mask, and I was able to go into his arms. I tell you all of this because before COVID, I didn't think it was possible to meet someone online and have feelings before I met him. I had friends who had met people over the internet and told me that they were in love with them before they had met face to face. And I have to admit, I was a little bit judgmental. I didn't believe that it was possible to love someone that you had never met in person. But what this whole experience has taught me is that there can be beauty and love and safety, even amidst a national pandemic, an international pandemic, and that it is possible to fall in love through a screen. Thank you.
Awesome.
Sarah.
That was beautiful, Sarah. That was beautiful. Thank you. Oh,
That was excellent. Nice job.
good job.
Made me cry.
Wow, great job, Sarah. Thank you for starting us off on such a high. You set the bar, so we are going to move to our next storyteller. So our next storyteller this morning is Karen Ross Murchie. And Karen also teaches in the Carroll County Public School System. She teaches art, and she makes incredibly beautiful hand-painted scarves. And she also does paint nights, which has really, I think, added to the local community. What I love about Karen, and what's been great to have her as part of this Tellers group, is that Karen brings this interesting balance of amazing enthusiasm and this complete centered groundedness. And both of these are always through this lens of compassion for other people. So it's a real gift to have her with us. And the story that comes to my mind when I think about Karen over this past year, the lesson I learned is that if you're going to take a ride in a lawn chair up in the air, you should pack a really big lunch and have a little drinky drink before you take off. That is what I learned. So please welcome Karen.
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for joining our storytelling group. Love in a pandemic. Manhattan has been the epicenter of COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. 222,000 people have been confirmed infected with the COVID. 23,696 people have died in Manhattan from the COVID. My dad lives in Manhattan. He lives up on the Upper East Side, and I live in Maryland. My brother and sister also live here in Maryland, and it has been incredibly difficult to be here, and my dad being in the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. Not being able to get to him, not being able to reach him, and not being able to visit with him. New Manhattan was in lockdown and Maryland was in lockdown. So we were all in where we were and nobody was moving. We spoke on the phone often, and FaceTime, but never the same as being face to face. And my brother and sister and I, really all we wanted was to put eyes on my dad and just make sure he was okay. We knew that he was being safe, but my dad being my dad we were concerned. Well, Father's Day was approaching, June 21st, just last month, just a month ago, feels like yesterday. And my brother and sister and I got together and we tried to figure out how we could get my dad out of Manhattan and come to us rather than us go to him. Well, we're lucky enough, I am lucky enough to have a brother who has his private pilot's license and also owns a small plane. And he concocted this idea to go to Manhattan, fly to a small airport just outside of the city, send a car to my dad, pick him up, and fly him back to Maryland. It was an extraction. My dad was extracted from New York on Father's Day, June 21st, and flown to Maryland, where he stayed at my brother's place and where we were all able to visit with him safely and without distraction. My dad and I sat on the porch from early in the morning, from about 8 o'clock in the morning, till late into the evening as the sun was setting. I hadn't gone into the house at all to keep the family safe and to keep my dad safe. But we were happy sitting on the porch, drinking tea, sipping water, talking and laughing and crying and talking about our past and our future and our present. It was a beautiful day. But it hadn't always been that way with my dad and I. Some years ago, we had struggled and we were not on speaking terms. Life was that way. I was stubborn and doing my own thing. And my dad was doing his own thing. And I just had no interest in building a relationship with my father. Well, my dad's wife, Helen, decided that this was not going to work at all because she could see that he was an amazing person and that I was an amazing person, that we both needed to come together and figure out what this issue was. So she very generously put together a trip for us to New Mexico. Well, I'd never been to New Mexico before, and I thought, wow, I would love to see New Mexico. We were originally born and raised in South Africa, and I'd heard about New Mexico. So I thought, okay, I'll pull myself together and I'll go with my dad to New Mexico. We'll see what happens. Now, the whole goal of the trip was to bring my dad and I together and have us begin to have a conversation. I was a little awkward at first. You know, we drove for hours and hours and we listened to music and we watched the scenery. Well, on one particular day, we decided to camp at Bandelier, which is a Hopi National Monument park in New Mexico. Absolutely beautiful part of the world. And we pitched our tents. My dad and Helen pitched a tent, and I, just next to them, pitched my tent. It was lovely. It was just out in the middle of nowhere. And we had our dinner and we all went back to our camps and we went to bed. I have never in my life seen such dark, beautiful sky. Even to this day, the stars, I've never seen stars as bright as I saw that night. And quiet. It was just deathly quiet. And in the middle of the night, I woke up to Helen talking to my dad, saying, Ian, wake up, Ian, wake up. There's something in the tent. And my dad said, Helen, go to sleep. There's nothing in the tent. Just go to sleep. And then it was quiet. And then a little later, Ian, there's something in the tent. Wake up, there's something in the tent. Helen, shh, go to bed. There's nothing in the tent. And then it was quiet. Well, we all fell asleep eventually. So in the morning, we woke up and Helen went off to the ablutions and do her morning thing. My dad and I began to break camp. So we took their tent down first. We reached into the tent and my dad grabbed Helen's sleeping bag and pulled it out of the door. And as he pulled the sleeping bag out of the door, there, laying at the bottom of the tent, was a dead bat. Well, I have never seen my dad turn a whiter shade of white than he did when he saw that dead bat lying underneath Helen's sleeping bag. I looked at him and I said, Dad, There was something in the tent. I heard her last night. You need to tell her there was a bat in the tent. Nope, I'm not telling her. Please don't tell her. Please don't tell her. I said, Dad, you have to tell her. She has to know there was a bat in the tent. So he agreed. You're right. We need to tell her. So he very carefully picked up the bat, dropped it into a plastic bag, tied it up, and held it and wait until she came back. Well, she came back and he sat her down and he said, Helen, I have something I need to tell you. Yes, Ian. And he held up the plastic bag and said, this is what was in the tent last night. You were right. And you slept on it and killed it, and it's dead. Well, I was very surprised at Helen's reaction. I was very proud of her, actually. She was so gracious. And she took the bag from my dad's hand and she said, thank you, Ian, for telling me about the bat. Now let's go and find out if it's rabid. So we marched ourselves over to the ranger station and we put it in front of the ranger and we said, we found this in the tent. And have we been bitten by it? And is it rabid? Well, it turned out the bat was fine. It was just a fruit bat and it was no problem. And nobody had been bitten. Well, later on that day, as we were driving through the beautiful roads of New Mexico, I realized, and I said to my dad, you know, we have some dead bats under our mat, and we need to bring them out, and we need to talk about them, and we need to tell each other about those dead bats, and we need to bring it out into the open so that we can begin to move forward. And he agreed, and that's what we did. And we spent many hours talking about our dead bats, why they've been laying under that sleeping bag for so long and we hadn't wanted to bring them out. But they came out and our relationship began to heal. And I realized that I was much more like my father than I would ever want to admit. For all of his characteristics and his talent and his strength, I had the same. Well, so sitting on that porch at my brother's house was more than just sitting on the porch. I felt so deeply grateful that my dad and I had been able to bring those dead bats out and that I didn't have to sit in Maryland and cry and long to see him because we were on speaking terms and we had healed our relationship and we were still able to sit on that porch and bring out those dead bats even to this day and still talk about them. Now with a lot of love and a lot of compassion and a lot of understanding. I love you, Dad.
Wow.
Wow.
That was a good story.
Yes. And for those of you who do not know, her father, Ian Ross, is actually here to hear this story and be such a support for his daughter as he always is. Thank you.
Very cool.
Oh, very nice. Very nice.
That was great, Karen.
Mhm.
Wow, that's such a great story. Thank you. Yeah. I now have the pleasure to introduce our next storyteller. Our next teller is Becky Barbour. Becky has the occupation that all of us wish we had right now. She is retired. And she retired from working in sort of the computer tech area. One of the things that I've grown to really enjoy and appreciate about Becky over this past year is that she is someone who has persevered in the face of formidable obstacles. And not only persevered, but she has prevailed. And so she has really been an inspiration of strength and of determination. And we are all so lucky to have her as part of our group. The stories that she's told over this past year have taught me many things. And I will tell you two things that I've learned from her stories this past year. One is that if you're doing yoga and you smell something bad, you should check it out sooner rather than later. The second thing I learned from her stories this year is that seeing a single glove laying on the ground can completely shape the trajectory of your future. So you can ask her about those later. So please help me welcome Becky Barbour.
I had to unmute myself. Good morning. Hello, everyone. It's hard to get going after that. For over a year, their friendship grew. They leaped from childhood to seniorhood, from cell tower to highway, from New Hampshire to Maryland. He was the brother that she had never had, and she was someone with whom he could share his thoughts without fear of betrayal. Step by step, they became closer. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, we had to push away people with whom we'd been close, family and friends. The physical distance had to grow. And they found that their virtual sharing of space became more and more important to both of them. And so they'd share more of their lives every day. And then there was a shift, just a subtle shift at first, but it grew. Their screen time became teasing. Their texts were suggestive. At one point, he sent her a link to a song, Help Me Make It Through the Night by Elvis Presley. And that became their theme song. They needed to be together. Screen time just wasn't enough. And he would drive for 5 hours so they could sit together for 4, and then he would drive back. When I say together, that's really pushing the envelope for what the word means, because in the age of COVID, that meant sitting 6 feet apart. That meant no hug, hello, no kiss goodbye. It was still better than screen time, but oh my word, so stilted and so twisted. What was normal? Who would ever know? And would they ever be able to experience that again? That continued until very, very early, one Monday morning, 2:30 in the morning, in fact, when they were texting. And the text, they went beyond just teasing, even beyond suggestive. And they finally had to call and talk to one another and hear one another's voices. And it was an agonized conversation until finally she said, please come now. And he did. But by the time he arrived, they were shy. The talks from the night before had sort of dissipated, and they had to spend some time kind of reacclimating to one another. They ended up going to a restaurant where they could eat outdoors, and she asked for his arm for support. As they walked into the restaurant, her fingers touched lightly on his forearm. The heat. The heat. When they got back to her place, they talked about what all of this meant. In the age of rules of the pandemic, what should they be doing as this relationship had warmed up? And they decided that they were each being very, very careful to be safe and to not put the other person at risk. And so they decided that they could be their safe person, each of them, and that they could sit a little closer than just their 6 feet apart. So as the dusk moved in, they pulled the deck chairs over to the side of the house, and they sat beside one another on the deck chairs on this perfect summer evening. And as they sat there in the twilight, he pulled out this bag of marijuana. It was a total surprise to her. She had no idea that he was going to do that. They talked about having smoked pot when they were kids, but neither of them done it for so long. So they lit one of the cigarettes and started to inhale or try to figure out how to make this work. This pulling it deep into your lungs and then letting it back out again. As the skies turned from lavender to indigo, their hands were stroking, searching. And then his hand ended up on her thigh. And she giggled and she said, "No, we didn't talk about this. I'm not thinking straight. I don't think we should be doing this." But the night got darker and her mood got lighter and her giggles mingled with the calls of the mockingbirds in the twilight, until finally he laughed with her delight as they took one another's hand and went into the house through the darkness. On that perfect summer evening, they went from physically distant to intimately entwined. Rules can't always hold us fast, not even the rules of the pandemic. Thank you.
Bravo.
Bravo indeed.
Oh, wow.
Another story. Thank you, Becky. I am going to sort of wrap things up a little bit here, and then once I do that, we'll be able to all unmute ourselves and have some more openness if we like. We might even convince somebody in this group to tell another story. We'll see. But let us draw this together. You may be wondering why I'm not telling a story in love in the time of COVID, although I'm part of this tellers group. And the answer is that I wasn't even supposed to be here this week. I was going to visit my mother, who is 80 years old, living alone. And in June, we had set this plan in motion to be able to get together for a visit. And at the start of this week, a whole series of events made it really obvious that this was not going to be a safe thing to do. And so for me, it was actually the lowest point of this pandemic since March. And I didn't really know what to do with myself because I had planned to spend this entire week with her. And then I got an email from one of our tellers, and then I got another email, and then I got a message. And it was as if my story sisters had come to my rescue and pulled me into their fold. And so they asked if I would participate with them in this performance by serving as the emcee. And I feel incredibly lucky to be here. So my learning of love in the time of COVID is really this group of friends that have come together through story, through Sheila's incredible inspiration. And I think what I take away is that we all have a story, and everybody's story is worth hearing. So with that, I thank all of you for being here. I'd like us to have another round of applause for these amazing tellers, and then we can open it up more informally. So thank you guys. What a great job.
Thank you, Melanie.
Nice.
Really quite nice. Well, I am just delighted. I loved what stories you all put together, and they just started on their stories on Tuesday, or just a little bit at a time. So
Wow.
it's really wonderful to see where the stories come in. This is the audience's opportunity, as Melanie said, to ask a few questions or give some feedback if you like to. Of course, we're always kind when people have just performed, and so So all the feedback is going to be kind and good. Tomorrow, if you have any other feedback, you give it to them that. But today, we're kind and we're good. So if you have feedback, please feel free, or if you have questions, feel free.
Well, I would just like to say thank you to Karen, my daughter, for a great story, and it really meant a lot to me. Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
That's really quite beautiful.
Yeah, that's a cool. That was a cool story. They're all good stories.
All really good stories. Oh, I'm not supposed to be recording this part. Sorry, let me stop recording.